Hello everyone, and welcome back to another Hearts of Iron 4 dev diary. Today we're going to be investigating whether or not Sweden is going to live up to the hype of being the flagship focus tree releasing with Arms Against Tyranny, or if that is going to fall to Finland as the two major kind of expectees to become the great nations of this DLC. From what we saw of Norway last week, the alt history seems to be looking really good, so it's going to be interesting to see if Sweden lives up to the hype in this week. So, without further ado, let's jump right into the dev diary. The Alt History Sweden dev diary actually jumps straight in at the beginning with a very short paragraph by talking about Communist Sweden. However, I actually don't think this is the best place for us to start, because they talk about some changes they actually made to some previously discussed things halfway down. So I'm going to jump down the dev diary and talk about some changes that were made to the historical and ALT-HIST democratic paths, and then we go right back up and talk about communism. So here are some small changes that, well, they say small, but could be quite impactful since the last time we saw Sweden. First off comes the Hunger Shield crises. So previously it was going to work on a stability threshold with lower stability, meaning that you were going to get a dice roll outcome to determine whether you get strikes or not, which kind of sucks because you basically have no control over if you're going to have a really good easy game or a bit of a struggle of a game. To combat this, they've gone the way of Mexico and Poland and a few other countries by giving you a decision timer which ticks down, and you can take decisions to try and combat it. In addition, the Nordic Defence Council, which was kind of more of a proactive alt-history democratic branch, has been expanded. As we can see in a previous dev diary, this is what the original Nordic Defence Council looked like. So in total it was looking like 7 focuses, ending in neither death nor dishonour, with the difference between centralised and decentralised basically being those 2 focuses on their own. Things have changed somewhat since then, as we can see in the new dev diary, so let's click on the image and have a slightly closer look. It would seem that the Nordic Defence Council has had a big split across the side, with looks like 5 focuses taking up underneath, with a decentralised Nordic Army Command increasing your industrial aid and some volunteer groups. Both get a research exchange, and more centralised giving you mills and merging of army complexes. We also see some focuses on the right, including build the Nordics, which is going to be a pretty big ship that tanks everybody else for you to build it. In addition to that, if nobody seems to want to accept your original invitation to join the Nordic Defence Council, you actually now have some decisions to try and coerce them into joining for 150 political power. So should you find yourself going down this path, it's not necessarily Jova for you should they say no. They wrap this section up by giving us an image of the Nordic Defence Council, which is good to see the 4 men all working together there. Maybe not as strong as a building. And we also get to see a guy called Raoul Wallenberg, who appears to be a sort of spy agency operative mechanic guy who gives you +1 operative slot, and also is an operative himself with, I think that's matched Hungarian nationality. So not terrible, although when would you be working with Hungary as Sweden? I'm not too sure. And finally, at the very bottom below that, we see the Lynx armoured car, which is a specific snow-focused armoured car, which means that you get the armoured car with some additional buffs for forest and snow, but reduction in desert. Again, why would Sweden be in a desert? I don't know. So I don't intend to spend too long talking about the resource changes that are coming, but to just give you some sum-ups of some stuff that we've seen previously. Resources in general for majors is being reduced. This is to kind of promote trading within the game, trading resources, especially with miners like Sweden, who are going to be stockpiling all of the major stuff. So as we can see here, Germany and France are really taking some major hits in regards to steel after the update, but a miner nation like Austria is actually doing pretty well. They've gained something, and the UK is also doing well, and that's to do with Africa. But we'll get into that in a second. So across the board, Europe has seen a reduction in steel, but Africa has seen a rise, and this is really to shift the gameplay of Africa being seen as this useless continent that is basically a lot of land that you have to garrison and gain resistance from, and is generally just an awful slog. Now there's going to be stuff in Africa, they hope, which is more of a justification for you to go and annex it. take note here of the British colonies in West Africa with tons of steel here, which is probably the reason why they've got ever so slightly more steel now than what they had before. Because Germany doesn't really have any access to any African colonies, they have World War I to blame for that, they have actually been given a focus, which is big news for Germany players, the German-Swedish trade agreement. So this is, in theory, a historical focus that you're going to be taking, which, if happens, gives you the resource right to Västerbotten. In exchange, Sweden gets 2 sieves and a mill, so really good outcome for Sweden, assuming they're not planning on really using a ton of the resources there, as well as some construction speed buff. The dev diary states explicitly that them getting the state of Västerbotten gives them 49 tungsten, 55 steel, and 21 chromium. To wrap up this section, the German focus tree has seen another change in the form of Operation, oh goodness me, is that Weserübung? Regardless, this is the focus that gives them war goals on Denmark and Norway, so just after the time they've gone after Danzig. The change to that focus seems to involve, should you own Norway, specifically the very northern tips of Norway, Sweden will be able to start transferring you iron through Narvik in exchange for civilian factories every 6 months. So you get 8 offshore civilian factories by the end of it. Something to bear in mind is, though, the United Kingdom is not going to like this, especially not the sort of Germany owning Norway part of it. So they can launch Plan R4, the British can, to invade Sweden, to stop you from trading with Sweden and Sweden from trading with Germany. So if you are playing as Sweden and you're doing the mega trading gameplay, just be cautious that Plan R4, the British are going to come invade you. Be very cautious. Okay, with all of that stuff done, let's actually get into the alt history Sweden dev diary. And we begin with Communist Sweden. So here we see the Communist focus tree branch for Sweden. There is something to talk about immediately. Previously, we've seen some focuses missing capital letters. Now we've seen very long focus titles lacking capital letters, which is also interesting. I feel like this focus immediately could be shortened to maybe like Landesorganisation alignment or something, but align more closely with land organization. It just feels like a wordful. It's barely fitting on the focus itself. But hey, maybe they'll keep it. Mexico needed some competition to anti-disestablishmentarianism, so I guess it comes in the focuses with tons of words in them. In general, we're not looking at too massive a focus tree. It takes part in the centre here about making some socialist reforms after you've turned the country communist, eventually moving down to some much greater advancements with the Politburo, and then it seems they're creating a Finnish buffer state, going after Norway, or at least making them communist, and going after Denmark. So a typical Nordic unity path towards the bottom. For those of you who want to experience the majesty of the communist focus tree branch, you'll have to deal with wholly receding hairline over here, Nils Flick. Kind of an awkward jelly bean to work with, he hates Stalin so much that he actually supports Germany in them invading Stalin, which, I mean, a self-hating communist to some degree, I suppose. He would sooner see them invaded than reformed or overthrown, but to each their own, I suppose. Should Flick not be to your liking, don't worry, there's Kilbaum available to you, Karl Kilbaum, who is, he's also an anti-Soviet socialist, so both candidates hate Stalin. So in this situation, no matter what you do, everybody hates Stalin, except this guy also doesn't like the Axis, but has more alignment to the Allies. So if you're playing as a communist, you're either Axis aligned or Allied aligned, but God knows you're not communist Soviet aligned. The actual horror of a communist focus tree in Hoi 4, which doesn't have a Stalinist branch. Terrifying. Absolutely terrifying. So as we move down, it is worth noting that there is no talk of a civil war, so the communist path is not involving a civil war so far as I can tell, but is actually about preventing a counter-revolution because the Fash are not really going to like communism coming up in the country. Luckily, as you move down the focus tree, you will be able to find the ringleaders, which are 3 specific generals, and you can either choose to prosecute them and get rid of them, giving you some stability, or choose to promote them to irrelevant places, where they'll effectively be neutered as being good commanders, gaining some division attrition and lacking supply efficiency. Solidifying control in good old communist Sweden will eventually get you down to some nice socialist reforms. So this is kind of the key point of being a communist in Sweden, is getting these reforms. So the way it works is you will get buffs through Folkhemmet equivalent to the amount of consumer goods factories that you're using. So this means less building things, but more gaining buffs across the board. Bringing the focus into full view, we can see that you gain a research bonus equivalent to 25% of consumer goods factories factor. So I'm going to assume that if you have 40% consumer goods, then you will get 10% research buff. For production efficiency cap equivalent to 50%, from 40 consumer goods you get 20% production efficiency cap. And on I think it would go. In addition to that, you also gain some decisions which improve weekly stability, research speed, and production efficiency growth for more consumer goods. So that's also a double buff because that will also add on to the pre-existing research and production efficiency cap buffs, meaning that basically I get the feeling that Sweden is going to be all about research with this path. That's a lot of research buffs. The refuge from war focus allows you to gain manpower from every country that is not currently communist, scaled on the proportion of communist support in that country. It does not, however, state which countries this will apply to, because one can only assume that, let's say, I don't know, Australia is not going to be relevant to this focus. So I'm not quite sure which countries are going to be applicable, but let's just assume countries in Europe that are currently at war are the ones where you're going to get manpower from. Next up, we have a really cool focus. I actually like this one a lot. This is one to bear in mind as one of those focuses that could be applied in other parts of the game. So Refuge for Revolutionaries means that communist advisors from other countries that are not communist, nor are they going down a communist focus tree branch, as in they're locked out of it, will get the advisors sent to Sweden. So that means that Portuguese, Polish, Lithuanian, Latvian, and I think that's Ethiopian communist advisors can all arrive in Sweden. It's really cool to think about, like opportunities in the game where, let's say, a country's going monarchist, for example, and they want some more monarchist support to come into their country. Well, if there's an advisor that's available that hasn't been used by a country that normally would use it going monarchist, then that feels like a good opportunity to give them like a decision or something to invite them in and get boosting. Side note, it does say at the bottom that you gain a political advisor for an exiled communist military council, which gives you really good division attack, but a ridiculously terrible buff of division org -16. I do have some inkling to think that maybe this is going to not be so terrible. -16 might be too harsh of a debuff, and that might be changed on initial release. But we wait with bated breath. Arms Against Tyranny has of course been about trading, introducing a sort of trading mechanic into the game, specifically with equipment. So a focus here, Starve the Fascia of Iron, has the ability to embargo the German Reich. It's a shame it doesn't have also for like every country that is fash in the game. I feel like Italy, Peru, Venezuela, I'm sure I'm missing somebody else. I feel like they all should be on the list. Hungary, of course, should you get to this focus, not just the German Reich. Side note, I have also noticed there have been very few focuses increasing construction speed, which would be relevant considering all the consumer goods are being raised, so the amount of factories you actually have to build things is lowered. Thus, an increase in construction speed might help to somewhat alleviate this pretty harsh penalty. To end the communist focus tree, as we saw when we looked at the initial branch, it ends with kind of unifying the Nordics under communism. So we see support Norwegian communists, which gives you Åndsvankleider, giving you an operative slot, and very, very importantly, propaganda mission effectiveness plus 20% and boost ideology mission effectiveness plus 20%. That boost ideology thing is super important for like some very meta strategies. So in terms of Sweden having some kind of mid to late game interest, it's something to take note of. The focus Universal Basic Income, or UBI as it's typically abbreviated to, gives you good stability, research, resistant target, but I'm not here to talk about that. I'm actually here to talk about the bit at the bottom, which says newly conquered states start with plus 25% compliance and 0% resistance. I think this is a really good focus thing to note, I think it's very useful for those who are wanting to do some expansion. And this is the part where I'm like, dear devs, as I'm like writing a letter to them, please consider in some capacity adding this functionality to Poland with Lithuania annex goals, because forming the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth is a nightmare because of the compliance requirement. Either that needs to be lowered, or a mechanic like this should be added onto the side, just to help them boost the compliance rate. Because currently, oh my goodness, it's quite a pain. Flying over to the flip side of the dev diary, we're now going to talk about fash and monarchism, and they're joint because the focus trees are actually joint, they are one and the same, which comes with it some positive and some negative benefits, but we're going to look into that as we go through. So here is the focus tree branch in its entirety. So at the top we've got prevent a red wedding, red dictatorship. On the left side you can choose to go down the monarchist section, and these are your monarchist focuses. On the right, these are the ones that change you to become a fash, choosing to either organise a putsch or having a delegation to Germany. Then at the bottom, you might notice that the two focuses join again with the counter-revolution, where either a monarchist Sweden or a fash Sweden choose to basically go on a something akin to Germany, where they conquer, let's go through this, Norway, Denmark, Finland, the Baltics, and possibly the Soviet Union. So these are kind of your major conquest focuses, like Germany has their major conquest focuses. We also see something a little trendy over here to do with joining the Allies. I'll be interested to see if that has a mutual exclusivity with being fash. I don't know why a fash would want to join the Allies. And finally on the right, we have what can only be described as the puppet branch, looking very similar to the Polish puppet branch, kind of like snapped in on the side here. So I guess this is if you want to be very aligned to Germany and eventually become the Reichsprotektorat Nordland. This section of the dev diary begins with a gigantic wall of text, and to that I have to say, I ain't reading all that. I'm happy for you though, or sorry that happened. Okay, to give you the TLDR, the long and short of it is, the conditions of Sweden in this time period were basically non-existent for either a monarchist or fash regime to appear. So they're really leaning hard into the alt history here in terms of feasibility of what could happen. So take everything that happens here with some salt and some leniency. The first focus we see is prevent a red dictatorship, which falls into similar focuses we see with some non-aligned and fash support and some base war support. To combat the growing threat of the Soviet Union on their borders, maybe they have some eyes on Finland, you might want to revoke the anti-militia laws to start building up some kind of army. If you're really leaning into the fash side of things, you might want to revoke the anti-militia laws, because the fear of the Soviet Union is so high that you might want to start building up a giga army. Regardless of whether you're going monarchist or fash, appealing for support is going to be quite relevant to you to actually gain control of the government, because as I said earlier, the likelihood of any of this happening is basically null. The friends you might want to be looking for are the industrialists, which probably involves giving them some consumer goods, the military, which let's say might cost you army XP or a military debuff, the rural folk, which again could be consumer goods, and the aristocracy, which goodness knows, that could be political power, that could be stability, who knows what aristocrats want. At this point you're going to have to decide whether you're going to be going monarchist, fash alone, or fash with Germany. So the fash with Germany path begins with a delegation to Berlin, slowly moving down to become their puppet. As you progress further and further down, getting more buffs for helping them and maybe integrating your militaries and economies more, you'll end with a similar ending that Poland got in their puppet tree, which is, do you want to remain, becoming a Reichsprotectorate for them, and maybe getting some claims in the region, or do you want to form a new order and effectively declare your independence? Of course, Germany's not going to like a puppet they previously owned becoming independent, so do prepare for them to go to war with you, should that happen. If you didn't go the way of kowtowing to the Germans, you will have found yourself as either a monarchist or an independent fash, and therefore you're going to be taking the counter-revolution, where the two branches join together. In doing so, you will lose Folkhemmet, because the social democracy of Sweden has kind of come to an end under these circumstances, and with it goes all of the stability. But you will at least be able to mobilise your country into a far more effective military regime. With that, we'll be taking a look at all of the focuses we saw earlier, which mostly involve conflict, but do have some interesting interactions with the Allies. So, the dev diary explains that should you approach the Allies, you have the opportunity to join their faction in exchange for Sweden's historical overseas territories being returned to them. If they do so, you can find yourself gaining territory in the Caribbean, Africa, and India. This is of course important to the Allies because they really don't want Germany to have your steel, your aluminium, all of that good stuff, and in doing so, as we saw with the Germany nerfs earlier, this can be quite impactful. Something the focus doesn't tell us though is, can an independent Fash Sweden do this? I understand a monarchy doing this, I just don't know why a Fash Sweden would do this. I know that the ideologies in Sweden seem to be very wish-washy, but this is very strange if they have access to this. On the opposite end, we see that Sweden has access to reclaiming the Rus. So we are talking some CK3 level historical claims going on right here, with Sweden saying they have the right to claim Russia, but because they are going after the Baltics, I suppose there is some kind of feasibility within that context. What I'm kind of surprised about, and maybe this is hidden in one of the focuses that isn't explained, is that there's no context to Swedish, is it Swedish Pomerania? That was once a territory owned by Sweden, next to like Mecklenburg. I feel like there could be more of a justification perhaps for there to be a focus specifically about regaining that territory, maybe asking Poland to get the Danzig region, and Sweden having its own Danzig or war focus, because the end goal, of course, would be for you to have the entirety of the Baltic Sea under your control. But I also guess that a miniature crusade into the Russian heartlands is also something you could strive for, considering their concerns about Stalinism and its threat on their border. And the dev diary concludes by showing us at the end of the day, with all of those conquest focuses you see, there are going to be some cores involved, and the focus at the end allows you to form this Det Stornordiska Riket. One can only assume then that you gain cores from this, not just on the Nordic states, but also on the Baltics, as well as on the northeastern parts of Russia, including Leningrad, which is nothing to be scoffed at. So all in all, what do I make of this particular branch? Well, at its face value, I do like it. So I like it because the most entertaining aspect of any minor nation in Hoi 4 is going to come down to, does it have lots of good, interesting expansion opportunities, whether that is war or whether that's going to be in some diplomatic arrangements. And this focus tree does really well at it. It's almost like, as they say, a miniature Germany. So no complaints there. My kind of issue, I guess you could say, is the distinction between a monarchist playthrough and a Fash playthrough seems almost non-existent, because the flavorful focuses to do with the independent ideologies, well, they're not there. They're almost exclusively just war goal focuses, right? So I guess my question, recommendation, idea, as it were, would be maybe to sprinkle in a few more unique focuses, maybe specifically tiered towards the monarchy side, to make it feel slightly more unique. For example, under the exchange of holdings, once upon a time, Sweden, back in its monarchy days, tried to establish a Swedish East India trading company, specifically in French India. It would be interesting to see then if Sweden would be able to maybe take French India. Technically, I think it was actually this part of Madurai, but let's pretend it's French India, because I'm almost certain they're going to be getting French India, to maybe build up a little part of French India under some kind of newly reformed Swedish East India trading company, maybe give them a little national spirit to do with it, give them a civ, because historically they tried to build a civ here, and the British and the French, I think they burnt it down a month later, so a really failed expedition here. The second thing I have to talk about in regard to this ending branch, and it's something I speak on ignorance on, so be cautious with what I say. Approaching the Allies and the Narvik crisis are mutually exclusive, and I just have to wonder why that is. Because sometimes in the game you can find that mutual exclusivity is actually a fun reduction as opposed to a strategy improvement, lest we forget Canada with its national steel car send in the zombies debacle. I guess my point is, I understand the idea that if Sweden goes to war with Norway, the Allies aren't going to like that too much, and vice versa. If you're in the Allies, going against Norway doesn't make much sense. But I think in context, should Sweden have done the Narvik crisis and united with Sweden and Norway, I feel like then the opportunity for approaching the Allies should become more available. So to put it to you another way, if you do approach the Allies first, the Narvik crisis is not available, could be one way of doing it, and then vice versa, if you do the Narvik crisis, you cannot do approach the Allies unless you've united the kingdoms of Sweden and Norway, therefore effectively making Norway part of you again, and then the part of you that is Norway would want you to work with the Allies, so then approach the Allies becomes green again. So instead of having mutual exclusivity, where maybe there doesn't need to be, there could be a limit or a choice of how you want to approach it. I just think it would be sad if you have the opportunity to unite the Nordics and join the Allies, and that gets kind of cut out because of one mutual exclusivity that maybe didn't need to be there. But that's just my opinion. Okay, I won't keep you here any longer with me rattling on about my different ideas, but I hope this was a somewhat interesting dev diary. What do we think of Sweden? Do I think it's better than the Norway focus tree, especially the ALT-HIST tree? I think that the expansion opportunities are kind of paralleled with a little bit more tacked on, although I guess going to war with Ireland maybe could be slightly more. I just think the Baltics are a stronger conquest opportunity. In addition to that, we also saw some conversation regarding to some things that could change. The Polish independence, similar mechanic, lots to see, maybe some stuff to be changed, but all in all, a pretty good alt history focus tree. So, if you like this video, please feel free to like, feel free to subscribe, also feel free to comment. I do like reading the comments, that's good too. And with that, I'll say goodbye. You really think I'm not going to say goodbye again? Of course I'm going to say goodbye again. Bye.